If you could, just say and spell your name, please.
Okay, it's Timothy McCarthy, and the first name's Timothy. Middle name Patrick, last name McCarthy, big M, little c, big C-A-R-T-H-Y.
Great. Okay, if you would, just as a start, then give me a kind of thumbnail sketch of who you are, where you've been, what you've done, what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And you can be as elaborate or not, as you'd like.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was born in upstate New York, in Albany, New York. I was adopted at birth. I was abandoned by my birth parents. I don't know that story, but never really wanted to know that story, which is interesting because I'm a historian. You would think I'd want to know that, and I haven't. But I was adopted by these two remarkable public school teachers from upstate New York. My father grew up in a very modest Irish-American household. My mother grew up in a even more modest and poor Italian-American household, and they both ended up going to college, or the sort of first of their generation to go to college, and became teachers. And they met in college. Actually, my dad went to an Irish or a Catholic boys' college. My mother went to a Catholic girls' college, and they met at a mixer. They got married shortly after college, and then became teachers in the Albany area. And I was adopted in June of 1971, and we grew up in the rural part of upstate New York, outside of Albany, for the first 8 or 9 years of my life before we moved to the suburbs in the city. And for me, it was this amazing sort of upbringing. My father was a basketball coach, and so I never had babysitters that weren't either my father's players or my family. So my mother came from this huge Italian family, so excuse me. So there was always a babysitter handy, and if there wasn't, my father had these players, so they would come over and take care of me whenever my parents wanted a night out. And so I was, our home became, it was sort of a hotel in some ways. We called them, many of my family members referred to it as Motel McCarthy, and we had all these different kinds of people who were coming through the home, not only family members, my father's players, but also we had foreign exchange students, we had foster children. I had two Chinese American girls who lived with us for a year. We had a Mexican foreign exchange student, we had a French foreign exchange student. So we had all these people coming through our home. The door was always open, and it was a really wonderful place to live as an only child. I was an only child, my parents couldn't have kids, so I was it. And one of the things that was striking about that upbringing was the way in which my parents gave an enormous amount of attention to my kind of creative capacities, to developing those. So I was reading, Choose Your Own Adventures and Encyclopedia Brown books, and to say nothing of all of the Dr. Seuss opus and all that, long before I went to school. So I was, in many ways, way ahead of the curve when I went to school, because my mother in particular, but my dad too, really, read to me and wanted me to read, and there was a lot of art going on, a lot of sports. And so there was this really, it was great. It was almost like being homeschooled before I went to school. And so I had these kinds of sensibilities that were developed in me that were very creative from a very early age. And so I ended up telling these fanciful stories when I was a kid. So I'd go to school and I'd tell these great tall tales, Timmy's tall tales. And I used to get into trouble because I was always sort of lying. I never thought it was lying. I thought it was just me being imaginative. And so I think in some ways my storytelling capacity goes back to that. I had these sort of rich family traditions of Irish and Italian storytelling that came out of those sort of immigrant tales and coming to America tales, but also was raised in the Catholic Church, and which is a church tradition that's based on rituals and storytelling and so forth. And so all of that kind of conspired to create in me a deep imagination about the world and about stories and about how people relate to one another in different ways. One of the crucial things that my parents did was, because I think they sensed that I longed for brothers and sisters, they filled our house with all these different kinds of people. And one person in particular was crucial to my early, I'd like to say now, my political imagination, was this kid. My parents signed up for the Fresh Air program, which is a sort of strange program where they take city kids, mostly black and brown city kids, and they send them to the country for the summer. And so my parents signed up for this thinking that it would be great to have someone come and spend the summer with me, so I would have a kind of partner in crime, a friend. I didn't have a lot of friends because I was a weird kid. I was a deeply weird kid. And so I didn't have a lot of friends. Everyone thought I was a bit of a freak. And I was, I suppose. But this kid, John Cottingham, came to visit us when I was, I think, 6 or 7. And he became my best friend. He was this black kid from East New York. We grew up in the projects. And so every summer, John, over time, it became a longer time. He came for a week at first, and then 2 weeks, and then ended up spending nearly a month with us every summer from the time I was 6 or 7 to the time I was 14 when I went to high school. And so my best friend, my first best friend really, was this black kid from East New York. And I don't think my parents did it as some kind of grand experiment in social engineering or to cross the race divide and the class divide in America. I think my parents did it because they really felt that I was lonely and I wanted more people around and people my age. And so, but when I think about the impact that had, right, here I was in a rural community in upstate New York where there were no black people. He was the first black person I'd ever seen that wasn't on TV. And here was my best friend who was black. And so when we just kind of did what little boys do, and we went everywhere, the candy store and the ice cream store, and played sports together, and it was totally normal for me. And I'm sure that it wasn't normal for everybody else in this community, but it was for me. And I remember being, there never being an issue about this in my home, even with my older relatives who may have had, different ideas about race than my parents did. And that was a formative experience to have as your best friend when you're a kid. As a white kid growing up in a rural area, this black kid from New York. And so I learned a lot about New York. And my father was from New York. My grandparents had been from there. So I knew about New York, but now I knew it in this way that someone my age had experienced it. So I remember having this longing to go visit New York, like very early on in my life. And of course, then I went there later on. And that was really crucial. And I think that for me, that friendship, which my parents kind of produced in some ways, has had a long-standing impact on the way that I see the world, not only in terms of race and racial justice, but also in terms of just who can be friends with one another and who can love one another. And so that's been, I think, crucial to my life. And when I think about the deepest and most meaningful friendships and relationships that I've had with my little brother who I adopted after college, with who is a mentee of mine, with my partner who's African American, with my students and the kinds of things that I'm interested in intellectually and committed to politically, I really go back to John Cottingham and my relationship with him. And I think if there's anything that I'm grateful for my parents and all the things I'm grateful for, I think I'm most grateful for that and that example of inviting him into our home and showing me that was not only possible but what should be done. And so as I grew up, I found myself very much yearning for and being part of and very intentionally creating a whole series of interracial friendships in school and through sports. I was an athlete for many years, played basketball, football, track, both in high school and college. And so my whole life was a kind of set of interracial friendships. And that was really important. My first lover was the black co-captain of my high school basketball team, which my father was the coach of. So things got very interesting and very complicated. But all of that, I think, has shaped the way that I view the world. And the way that I see the world is really as an opportunity to build bridges and to cross boundaries. Right. And I think I've done that in my work. Yeah. I've done that in my life. I've done that in my love. And in my politics, and I believe.
Well, so before we get to kind of what you've done with that, and kind of where, we'll kind of trace your trajectory from upstate New York in a minute. But can you talk about the political dimensions of that? And like from that early relationship with this kid from New York, through early adulthood, kind of how would you describe the kind of political or politicizing dimensions of this sensibility that you had?
Yeah, I mean, long before I ever knew about the old feminist mantra, the personal is the political, which really, in my mind, really characterizes that era of the 60s and 70s within which I was born and came of age. Long before I knew of that, I felt that in my life, that there was a certain kind of statement that my parents were always making to emphasize my education, to make sure that I was exposed to arts and creative outlets, to make sure that I had lots of different kinds of friends and languages and peoples in our home and in our family, in a way that was very intentional. And when I think about that intentionality, I think about the kind of Catholic worker movement, which was a movement, the kind of social justice Catholicism that my parents very much embodied. And
so that was a very kind of self-conscious and overt part of their
think so.
Catholicism.
I mean, I'm not sure if I don't know if they intended it as much as I now think they must have. But I do think that it was there. I mean, my parents were very much public servants in the broadest sense of the word, that they believe in helping others and having broad empathy for other people and loving your neighbor as thyself. And that was always at the core of the way that my parents lived their lives and the kinds of things that they sought to teach in me and instill in me. So I think that kind of personal commitment to a broader politics of empathy and equality was really there from the very, very get-go. It was sort of literally in my home. And that's the way that that my worldview was shaped. I think it got politicized really in the 80s when I started to sort of come of age as a teenager, after I hit 10 and stopped thinking about Star Wars all the time. I entered into the Reagan era, where there was a different kind of Star Wars, where there was nuclear proliferation, and there was growing gap between rich and poor, and the silence over AIDS, and the kind of the ramping up of the Cold War, and the scapegoating of welfare queens, and all of the sort of pitched battles over politics that occur both in the United States and in the world was something that I was very much drawn to. And I couldn't stand Ronald Reagan, and part of it, I think, was because there were people in my family who couldn't stand Ronald Reagan. But I remember thinking what a horrible person this guy was, and then at times really thinking about how unbelievably successful he was at masking that. Mm-hmm. That in some ways that he had hoodwinked the country. And so I really came of age during an incredibly high-pitched kind of political context where the things that I had been sort of compelled to see as a child in a less political way now became very political. And I saw the friendships that I had, I think particularly the interracial friendships that I had, as things that were going against the grain of what you were supposed to do in society, particularly as a white person with a kind of middle class inflection. Although I always characterize my upbringing as working class because I think that kind of ethic of working hard and trying to make ends meet and struggling to figure out how you're going to pay all the bills was something that was very much alive and well in my home. The stories about working in factories, of getting screwed out of your pension, of going from one job to another, of being unemployed, of my father having to work over the summers, always painted houses and ran basketball camps over the summers to supplement his income. We had the same cars for my entire childhood. We never got new fancy cars. We went on very modest vacations if we went on them at all. And so I think that working class sensibility, that idea of struggle, but also paired with that idea that even if you're struggling to make ends meet in your own life, that you still care for those who are less fortunate than you, that was a very real ethos that surrounded me all the time. And so I do think that the coming of age in the Reagan era, particularly in the 80s, being in high school, I entered high school when Reagan was reelected. And I became a newspaper editor in my paper, and I wrote op-eds, and I started to forge, be identified as a leader, and I went to a lot of leadership institutes and so forth. And I remember always being the one who questioned authority, always being skeptical of those who were deemed leaders and who were invested with power, because I saw so many of those people really corrupted by that, and that was always something that I felt was a problem. And I think particularly issues of racism and poverty were the things that really were particularly problematic for me, and also war. I mean, the idea of I'm old enough to remember the air raid drills where we would have to leave our classrooms. It was sort of like a fire drill. We would leave our classrooms and then go huddle against some cement wall. And I remember one day when I was in 5th grade, I was doing a spelling exercise, and we were told to leave the classroom and do this drill, and I refused to do it because I told my teacher that I'd rather die doing my spelling assignment than die huddled against the wall in fear over something that I didn't understand. And I remember thinking,
so where do you think that comes from in a fifth grade kid?
Well, I mean, I was terrified. I mean, I think we were all terrified. I mean, there was so much jingoism and so much fear-mongering that existed. I mean, I think one of the reasons I had such a profoundly negative and activist and radical reaction to the Bush administration, because I really saw it as being the kind of 21st century incarnation of the Reagan era in a more treacherous world. And I was terrified of that as a kid. I think part of it was I was hearing things at home, and I remember, Ted Kennedy was a great hero, Mario Cuomo was a great hero, Tip O'Neill was a great hero, Franklin Roosevelt, going back, was a great hero in my home. Right, those were the people we talked about those were the political figures that we talked about favorably in my household. So Reagan was like the antithesis of all of that. And he was also, as my grandmother once said, a very, very bad actor. And I think that he, in some ways, he was a better actor as president than he ever was in Hollywood, which is to the country's detriment, I think. So I think part of it was just that I was terrified, and that I didn't like feeling helpless. And I think that moment, if I can kind of read back on that moment, and I got in trouble for that. I remember my teacher, who I love very much, who I think probably was gay. He, in retrospect, he was someone I loved and who loved me, and he had to punish me because I wouldn't go along with this drill. And I remember thinking, well, that's silly. Here's this guy who likes me and who I like very much, who's punishing me because I won't submit to this kind of fear. And I feel like, part of it was just I'd always been a bit of a rebel, always. That was always the case. And I was often challenging authority, whether it was church teachings or what the priest said or what my teachers told me to do, or even sometimes what my parents told me to do, although they gave me a lot of latitude to kind of be me, which I'm always still very grateful for. So I think part of it was fear. Part of it was a desire to be able to have a say in this, to not accept what was going on, to not accept the fact that we were engaged in a kind of nuclear proliferation that would lead to the annihilation of the world for no good reason. And I just couldn't understand why the Soviet Union was so bad, right? And why there was this kind of boogeyman out there and communism and all these things. And I had no idea about why. There was no traction there for me. There was no substantiation about why these things were bad. They were just boogeymen. And they were used to scare us. And they scared the shit out of us. And certainly me. And so I think at some point I just said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'd rather die spelling. If I'm going to die, crouching against the wall is not going to save my life either. I'd rather die doing something, intellectual, at least, so I sort of seized that moment. So I think, that period definitely politicized me, and that was true also of college, where, I went to college the fall after Tiananmen Square.
And where was that?
I went to Harvard College, and I was, this kid. I was the second person in my high school to go to Harvard, in the history of my high school. The first actually had been the captain of my father's first basketball team in my hometown, who gave me my first book, McCulloch's Pool by Dr. Seuss, which is all about optimism. It's all about hope. And I remember writing my college essay, one of them about McCulloch's Pool, and the idea that there's this older farmer who doesn't believe that there's fish to catch in McCulloch's Pool, and the young man sits there in this little tiny pool of water, and he imagines this expansive sea where all these different kinds of fish live, and that he's gonna if he waits so long enough and he has enough determination and optimism, that he will indeed catch a fish. And by the end of the piece, he's sort of convinced the farmer to be less of a pessimist. And I remember reading that as a kid and really loving that little kid who was fishing in McCulloch's Pool. So I wrote that, and it was a serendipitous moment, because this book had been given to me by this captain of my father's basketball team, which I then became also captain of my dad's team, and he was the only other kid from my high school who went to Harvard. And so for me, going to Harvard was a weird thing, because on the one hand it was this enormous kind of achievement for my high school, for my community, for my family. I remember one of my cousins said to my father at my graduation ceremony, he goes, Tom, how can you and Michelle possibly afford to send Timmy to Harvard? And I remember my father's response, without missing a beat, was, how on earth can we afford not to? And that was sort of my parents, right? They were going to make it happen, and they always did, where I was concerned. And so I was always very grateful for that. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't done the work to find out who my birth parents are, because they couldn't possibly measure up to the parents that I was blessed to have. And so I went to Harvard, right after the Tiananmen Square conflict, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I saw Nelson Mandela walk out of jail. When I was in college, there was a lot going on at that time, and I think that another war, another Gulf War, and I felt like that period of time between sort of Reagan's election and Nelson Mandela's election was the period of time where I was I was fifth grade to my first year of graduate school. And so when you think about that, the election of Reagan when I was 10, and the election of Mandela when I was 23, that's a pretty intense time to come of age in the world, where you're trying to figure out what your identity is and what your place is. And I think that, we all are shaped by the context of our times, but I think that was an exciting time to live.
So at what point would you say you kind of became an activist in the classic sense of like, you were engaged in organizations or community work or those kinds of things?
Well, the first thing I did was when I was I think in 5th grade, I wrote a letter. We had to do a civics assignment where we wrote to a public official, and most people wrote to like the town supervisor or the school board person or something, and I wrote to Reagan. And I wrote to Reagan basically protesting the nuclear proliferation. I don't think I used the word proliferation because I was 11, 10 or something. But I remember my grandmother, who had been a New York public school teacher and was a fierce and feisty woman, a really remarkable woman, died of cancer when I was a freshman in high school. But she had a formidable and formative, sort of presence in my life. And she helped me write the letter, I remember. And so I wrote it, and then I got back in the mail this 4-page letter from Ronald Reagan, with not handwritten, obviously. It basically was the Reagan administration's justification for the Cold War, and why we needed to have these things to keep us safe. Similar to the bullshit that comes from the Bush administration. Right, exactly. Dear young American child, we need nuclear arms because we don't want to reach it. So anyway, and I remember getting this back with a glossy picture of Ronald Reagan and signed by him, and I remember being disgusted by this, as was my grandmother, who really understood what the kind of ideological dimensions of what was going on, and I remember my school wanted to celebrate this, that Timmy McCarthy had gotten a letter and from President Reagan, and I remember my family sort of being not as thrilled as the school was with this. So that was, I think that was the sort of first moment where my foray into that world. But and then in high school, I was the editor for my paper, one of the editors for my paper, the front page editor, and my colleague, one of my dear friends and I did an investigative report on sort of public school health curriculums and how or whether they dealt with AIDS. Mm-hmm. And this was in 87, 88, so in the birth of ACT UP, right around the time that Reagan finally acknowledged that AIDS existed. And I remember thinking, we don't talk about any of this in our health classes, which included sex ed and these kinds of things. And so we basically did a survey of different schools in the area, and we wrote this very controversial two-part front page article about sort of how public high schools deal with the AIDS crisis. And I remember getting a lot of pushback from people. We had a newspaper editor in my high school, our advisor, who was an English teacher named Tom Smith, who was very supportive of this and really encouraged us to be these kinds of young journalists. And we did this, and I remember, people, it really did intervene in a kind of culture of stigma. There was a heavy Catholic presence in my community. There were a lot of conservative Republicans there. There were a lot of liberal Democrats too. It was a kind of mixed community in that way. And I remember people being sort of, whoa, why are they doing this? And in retrospect, now that I think back as an openly gay man, which I was not at the time, even though I was involved in a sexual relationship with my high school best friend and co-captain of my dad's basketball team, I remember, I can't help but think that there was something there. I was trying to say something there. And I could tell that there was this kind of repression and stigma around AIDS that really unsettled me. And of course, I was terrified by AIDS too. Right, I was probably at least as terrified about AIDS as I was about dying because the Soviets sent us a nuclear bomb. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that I was coming of age sexually at that time, and I thought at the time that any sex with any man, particularly this guy who had been a transfer student from New York City, was probably going to lead to my death. I remember the first time I had sex, I really did think that I was probably going to die, but I liked it a lot. So it was this weird juxtaposition, as sex often is. And so I think those were two moments when I was younger where my kind of activist tendencies came out, literally. But it really wasn't until college that I started to define myself as an activist, as someone who sort of self-consciously attended protests, attended rallies, did community organizing, volunteered in the public schools and the homeless shelter and other kinds of things in college. And so I think I was emerging in college as a mix of kind of a political activist and also a kind of public servant. And I remember at Harvard there being very much a distinction made between those two things. The public servants sort of serve food at the soup kitchens, activists critique the structures of poverty that create homelessness and hunger. And I remember thinking, well, why do these things have to be distinct? I mean, you can serve food at the same time you critique poverty. You can teach illiterate children at the same time that you study the slave narrative tradition in the United States. And so these kinds of connections, I was, again, a kind of border crossing. I was trying to figure out how can I be at once a political activist and a public servant? Because I think that both of those kinds of things enrich the other. Mm-hmm. And I've continued to really try to forge a connection between those things as someone who volunteers and gives back and donates money and mentors and these kinds of things, but also as someone who writes and teaches and speaks out about these larger critiques about society.
Okay. Let's loop back and pick up some of these issues in a minute, but first let's finish sketching out your graduate school and then on into your professional years.
So I think that, in college I happened to be at Harvard at that weird time when, the world was changing very profoundly, and particularly the situation in South Africa, which became something that we were concerned with here. And my first protest rally I went to in college was a South African divestment. Rather, we're trying to get Harvard to divest its resources from South Africa, which it never did. And then it had to apologize publicly to Nelson Mandela in the fall of 98, when I came back to teach at Harvard, when we gave him an honorary degree. And so that was one of those great moments where I realized, if the institution had done the right thing then, they wouldn't have to do the right thing now after the fact. And as, characteristic of Mandela, he was incredibly gracious about accepting that apology. I don't know if I would have handled it as well. So that was important. But at the same time that was going on, Henry Louis Gates and Anthony Appiah and a number of African American studies scholars came to Harvard to kind of reinvigorate the African American studies program here. And then it became, while I was here, and then subsequently, the kind of flagship Afro-Am program in the world, really, and I benefited enormously from that. So I began to take classes on slave narratives and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and African American literature and the Harlem Renaissance and all of these courses, which really changed the way that I thought about the country. Not so much as they were revelations to me that I didn't ever think about race or class or gender or these things. I had been thinking about those things for years, but it gave me a language, it gave me a history, it gave me a kind of cultural context and political context to really place all of this other stuff that at that time was really kind of floating around and sort of bumping into one another. But it gave me a kind of language as an activist and as an intellectual where I could root some of my observations and opinions and analyses. And so that was crucial. And so I developed over the course, I came to Harvard, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to come here, major in economics and government, go to law school and run for political office. That was what that's what I was coming. I thought, wow, this is great. I grew up in Albany, where Mario Cuomo was the great kind of hero, anti-Reagan hero. I loved him. I wanted to be like Mario Cuomo. He was my and Tip O'Neill. Those are my two sort of guys that I really, and they were guys, that I really admired. And so that was sort of the path that I thought. I was going to be like a working class kid from upstate New York who went to Harvard and then, became governor or something, or senator. And I quickly got here and realized that all of the students, many of the students that that also wanted that kind of a future, were really not particularly appealing people. That these were the young politicos who did this undergraduate student council and other kinds of the campus Democrats, that I didn't really like them very much. I found them to be really, to be very safe and guarded and unimaginative in the kind of world that they were thinking to create. And that was because they had a particular political disposition. They believed that you could change things solely within the system. And I didn't believe that. Right, especially after I started studying social movements and started studying protests and these kinds of, particularly in the African American tradition, that's almost everything that's been accomplished for black people in this country has been accomplished by black people in this country outside of institutions of power.
Agitation.
Through agitation and organizing and protest, often mostly nonviolent protests and organizing. And that to me was a powerful story and a powerful lesson. So I was more drawn to that. And so by the end of undergrad, I had applied to PhD programs, and I was going to, move to New York and go to Columbia and live in Harlem. And, my grandfather had grown up in Harlem. He grew up about 4 or 5 blocks from where my first apartment was when I moved into Morningside Heights, which is the sort of area around Columbia. I say that they construct this area of Morningside Heights as to indicate to incoming students, particularly white students, that it's near but not Harlem. So I moved into Harlem and what they call Morningside Heights, and I immediately kind of set out to become a historian of African American culture and politics, and to do this in a way that would allow me to be an academic but also an activist, and to be a public intellectual. And so the people that had become kind of important figures in my life were people like Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West and Robert Coles, who was a mentor of mine in college. These people who managed to be both intellectuals, scholars, teachers, but also people who had a say in the world and who were trying to change the way that people think about the matters of great importance in our world that were hard to solve. And so I was drawn to those folks. So I shifted from a kind of sense of politics as running for public office to a sense of politics as having a say in the world. And not that you can't do both as a politician, the best politicians do, but to me it became something slightly different. I wanted to be closer to that radical tradition that I had been so taken by. And so when I got to graduate school, I continued to I immersed myself fully in the study of this. I got a very grateful to have gotten some funding through the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, where Manning Marable had just come to Columbia the same fall that I arrived in graduate school, in fall of '93. And he set up this institute, and it was an institute that from the very beginning was about ideas and politics. It was an institute at Columbia, but it was very much also an institute in Harlem. Mm-hmm. And it was very much forged in that spirit. And Manning was this great kind of figure to me, a father figure in many ways, who hired me. And I was the only white person who worked at the Institute for the first 3 or 4 years that I was there. From 94 to 98, when I left, I think I was the only white person who worked there. And my nickname was Manning's White Hand Man. And I remember loving that. I remember feeling so proud to be the white guy that worked at the Institute. And it was sort of silly, I suppose, in retrospect, but there was something about growing up at that moment, the moment of Rudy Giuliani's New York, of the police, the police shootings of black teenagers and adults, the Million Man March, the welfare reform debate, the crime bill debate, the rise of church burnings that I became involved in later on. Living in Harlem, being at Columbia, working with Manning Marable and Eric Foner and some other folks there who also positioned themselves as public intellectuals, as scholars and activists, was a great time to be there. And it shaped, I think, it sharpened both my intellectual critique of history and society, but also my kind of activist sensibilities to try and change the world. And so I went to graduate school, and I had a very different kind of time in graduate school, largely because I had the great fortune of working with Manning at the Institute. And so there was always in my mind this idea that I had to do all of those things well. I had to teach, I had to research and write, and I had to be an activist in the world. And those three things were not mutually exclusive. They weren't irreconcilable, as you're always taught in the academy, but they were things that were always in creative tension with one another, and they had to be kind of merged. That it was our responsibility in some way to try to integrate these things that often get compartmentalized and often forgotten pieces of it on the search for tenure, or the desire to publish in referee journals, and the kinds of things that traditional academics do. I always found myself being pulled away from that a bit, because I felt like that work, while important and while understandably important to a lot of people, was something that I felt was less relevant than the kind of other work that I could do in the world that gave me much greater joy. And so it really was at Columbia that I kind of, I think, sharpened both the political and the intellectual work that I was doing, and it gave me a rich context to do it. And to be able to do it at Columbia, which has this great radical tradition on its faculty and among its students, and also in Harlem, which has its own unbelievable history, 4-5 blocks away from where my grandfather, as a young Irishman, grew up and forged his own identity, was to me the kind of perfect storm.
Right.
And out of that emerged sort of what I am now. I'm not a whole lot different now, I don't think, than I was when I was 26 or 27, other than the fact that I finally came out of the closet. That's probably the big difference.
Well, I want to, before we get up to the kind of the present moment in the U.S., and that moment of hope and danger that we were talking about earlier, there are two pieces I'd like to kind of lay in about there's just the recent decades and kind of a longer trajectory kind of discussion. One, and you can kind of talk about this in any terms that you want to or in any order, but one is the work that I know you got involved with around the justice issues around church rebuilding and the church burnings, mostly in the South, but not exclusively in the South. African American churches, I know you've done a lot of work with that. And then the other is just your kind of long-term sense of kind of LGBT struggles since the 80s, since that moment that you described in Reagan's America, and your kind of fear and outrage around the politics of AIDS, because we've, in some ways we've come so far, and in some ways we so have not come very far, and it would just be, I think, really interesting to hear you kind of reflect on your view of kind of where we've arrived, especially at this moment where between Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the marriage issue, it's a very complex picture. Yeah.
Well, I think I would, those are great questions. I think I'd tie them together by saying that, in many ways, my own history of my life, being born in 1971 and now about to turn 40 this spring, I was born in an odd time. Right, that in some ways, I've mentioned this before, and you've heard me say this, that if there's a word that describes nostalgia for something that you haven't experienced, that would be how I would describe my relationship with the 60s. And so and also with the 1830s and 1840s, 1850s, I wrote my dissertation, as you know, and I've written about the abolitionists, and I love the abolitionists because they're sort of they're the 60s, 100 plus years before, and so I'm still compelled by them. I mean, I love the abolitionists and reading the letters and so forth. So anytime a book comes out or letters are published or something, I always go get it, because I find their courage and their complexity and their unbelievable willingness to kind of challenge society to be quite striking and really radical in the most fundamental definition of radical. But because I was born in 1971, I came of age at a time when there was reaction to all of the progress of the 60s. I think if you came of age in the 60s, you have a sense of the world as having the capacity to always get better and to move forward and to make progress, because there was such a telescoped sort of relief of progress that manifested itself in the 60s. And so I can imagine if you were part of that, as treacherous as that time was, and I don't want to romanticize 60s, because there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of reaction, there was a lot of terrible violence in the 60s, so it wasn't all kumbaya by any means, but I think there was at the time a sense of possibility in the future. I mean, I think if you grew up in the 70s and the 80s, if you're a black person, or you're a gay person, or you're a poor person, or you're a woman, you grew up in Reagan's America, that's not a place that is, if you're on the margins, or you're subjected to some kind of subordination or discrimination, that's not a moment where you can imagine possibility coming right around the corner. In some ways, that conservative insurgency that really literally captured the country for 30 years, and we're still recovering from or extricating ourselves, or failing to extricate ourselves from, that produces a different kind of worldview. It's not a worldview where you think progress is inevitable, right? It's a worldview where you realize that progress is fleeting sometimes. And I'm an optimist. I mean, I go back to the McCarthy pool reference. I mean, I'm an optimist. I do believe that you can fish in little puddles and catch big things. I do believe that. And at my core, I am, one of the reasons I love Howard Zinn so much is I thought Howard was at his core an optimist about people. Maybe not about society or institutions of power, but he was at core an optimist about the capacity of human beings to be decent. and loving and kind. And I believe that. And so I have this strange juxtaposition about, on the one hand being an optimist and really having hope and channeling that hope in the best ways when I'm at my best. But I also have this very stark kind of realization and perspective on the world that we can never take progress for granted. That we always have to be agitating in order to stop the flow of reaction, to stop the kind of juggernaut of conservatism. That unless we remain vigilant and we're always agitating or activists, we're in some ways allowing those countervailing forces, which are poisonous forces, which create the danger and the treachery from my perspective, we allow them to win or to get an edge or to get an advantage. And so I'm constantly, it may seem sort of paranoid, but I don't think you can live in my skin in this world and not be concerned constantly about those countervailing forces of conservatism and reaction. And so for me, every time I sort of take a break or go on vacation or dive into my work or my writing, I'm constantly pulled back to the real world by that concern. And so, and this flows into the questions you were talking about with the church burnings and the LGBT movement, that both of these instances, both of these things that I've spent a great deal of my time engaged with and preoccupied by, are examples of exactly what I'm talking about. Right? On the one hand, you have this resurgence of black church burnings that takes place in the mid-90s, where you have clusters of burnings that are happening that recall the sort of horror of the civil rights movement, the worst battles over segregation and integration that created all of that violence and also all of that optimism in the 60s. And so here we were in the mid-90s, right, having made all of this progress, and we're still seeing these black churches burned by people who are motivated by racial animus or religious intolerance. And I'm thinking, my God, is that progress? And so when that happened, I remember I went down south, and it was really the first time I'd ever been in the South or spent time in the South. I'd gone to Disney World or those things, but I'd never been to New Orleans for the Final Four, but I had never been in the South. And I remember Robert Coles, one of my mentors in college, telling me, if you want to understand this country, you have to go south. And that was my time. The mid-1990s was my time to go south, and I started to work on these churches and help to rebuild them, and I learned a lot about the country. And one of the things I learned about the country is that we can't ever take progress for granted, that there are always going to be white racists, and there are always going to be a number of white racists who want to do harm to black people because they don't think that they're fully human. And if we live in America, we live in that reality. We can choose to ignore that reality, or we can choose to confront it. And for me, I choose to confront it. I always have. Getting back to John Cottingham, when I think about all of the black people that I've known in my life and what they've given to me and how they've loved me and accepted me, that's the model I want to pay forward in this society. And I think I have a special obligation as a white person to do that, especially as a white person who understands the history of this country in the way that I do. Right? That's a particular kind of responsibility. You're the same way. You understand the history of race in this country, in similar ways that I do, and it compels us to act, right? To model a kind of behavior in the world that resists, again, that countervailing force of racism. And so for me, these church rebuilding projects have reminded me over and over and over again of the intransigence of racism, and the power of it. But on the other hand, it's also put me in context where I can build bridges and cross boundaries of race, of class, of religion, of sexuality, with people that I would never have known had this crisis or tragedy not happened, that have actually produced in me a sense of community that is even broader than I had in the first place. And that community coming together across those boundaries and across those lines, which are meant to divide us, and to intentionally do that over and over and over again, and keep doing it over and over and over again, I think is a powerful example of how we can actually forge hope and optimism and community and equality in the midst of that tragedy, in the midst of those forces that are constantly coming at us. And so for me, these trips remind me of both of those things. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the kind of stubborn, tragic racism that is so central to this country's identity still. and on the other hand, this amazing possibility of kind of cross-cultural or interracial optimism that's also at the core of this country's history. And that those two things are always at odds with one another. They're always in conflict. They always threaten to both undo the nation and also make it a more perfect union. And it's that kind of tension, those historical forces which are so deep, which predate the country, right? That are so deep that I see over and over again when I do this work. And I think it's one of the reasons why I do it, because I see history played out in my own time, and I see myself in some ways, and all of the students and the congregation members and the people that I do this work with every year, now numbering in the hundreds and hundreds of people over the course of the last decade and a half. I'm reminded of how we can be historical agents. One of the things about my nostalgia for the 60s is that when we romanticize or we live in a kind of moment of nostalgia for the past, sometimes that paralyzes us as agents of change in the present to create a future that we hope to live in. And if we're constantly preoccupied with the past, and as historians we are, and I cop to that, certainly, but as people who are constantly preoccupied with the past, oftentimes we forget that we can be agents of change in the present. One of the things that I say at the end of my protest literature course, I teach this course on American protest literature from Tom Paine to Tupac with John Stauffer here at Harvard. And at the end of the class, I always tell my students, are you going to be in the index of the history book 100 years from now? Will you earn your place in the history book as an agent of change? When you look at the index, you see all those names now of people from the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. 100 years from now, at the dawn of the 22nd century, will your name be in the index? And that is a future-oriented thing for them, rather than a kind of historically oriented thing. So that's the sort of church burning work. And then the LGBT work that I do is in many ways very different because, I'm not a black person who has experienced racial discrimination, right? I am not a poor person who experiences the burdens of poverty in the midst of global capitalism. I am not a woman that is constantly, being subjected to discrimination and physical violence. I'm not an immigrant that is undocumented who is, going to be deported if they're found out. So I don't live in those skins, and yet I do live in a gay skin. Right? And so for me, being that work is motivated in some ways by self-interest. Right? It's motivated by, don't fuck with me. Right? Rather than the other work that I do, which is don't fuck with them. Don't fuck with us. And so I think there's a different relationship to that work as a result, if it directly affects you in your own skin. That's not to say I don't think solidarity and coalitions aren't absolutely essential to broader social justice work, absolutely, and I would be the first to admit that. But I think this LGBT work for me is real in a different kind of sense, because I see in my own life on a daily basis the kinds of insults and discriminations and stigmas that LGBT people are dealt on a daily basis. And they're different stigmas. They're different prejudices and forms of discrimination. They're not the same that other groups have experienced or do experience. There's some overlap, certainly. But the work and I've been drawn to this work late in my life. Not that I'm old, but relatively late. I've been doing racial justice and socioeconomic justice work and peace work and other kinds of activism for a long, long time. And you can see the well springs of that work really early in my life, if you think back. But this work I've been drawn to relatively recently because I came out so late. Even though I had asexual experience with one of my high school buddies for a very long time. Actually, he was the only person I had any kind of homosexual relationship with for 15 years, 10 to 15 years. And so I wasn't, partly because I was terrified of AIDS. right? I didn't want to be promiscuous because I was afraid if I'd been with this guy and I didn't have AIDS, and so if I'm just with him, I won't get AIDS. Meanwhile, I was having sex with women, and that didn't stop me either. So, I mean, there was all this confusion that is shaped by the stigmas that we have and the perceptions that we have about who's a carrier and who's diseased and who has the potential to do this. And so much of that behavior, when you're behaving out of a set of misinformations and stigmas and prejudices, so much of that behavior is so dangerous to so many people, not only yourself but other folks. But this work for me really has taken on a particularly kind of powerful dimension recently, as I've become more out and more sort of openly gay and more of a kind of leader. And in some ways, I feel like I know the struggles that I endured when I was locked in the closet. And I was locked in the closet for a lot of reasons. I was locked in the closet because I grew up a Catholic, and you never get any messages from the Catholic Church that are pro-gay. I grew up an athlete, with a whole set of, understandings about masculinity and femininity and sexuality that were very rigid and very binary and very damaging. And I think more than anything, it was me coming out was a process of getting out from under that sort of sense of myself as a kind of macho, masculine athlete. The irony, of course, is that I had my first sexual encounter within the context of sports with a teammate. And so again, it's very complicated, but that kind of, those codes of masculinity and machismo that are so central to the forging of a kind of identity as an athlete were very much there. I was also the only child and the only grandchild. I was the star, right? I was the one who was, I was the source of pride. And the idea of being gay and having that undermine, in some way, the ability of my family and my hometown to be proud of me was very, very debilitating. And there were other reasons too. I mean, I had, by the time I moved back to Harvard in 1998, when I was really struggling to come out, I was still dating a woman at the time, contemplating getting engaged actually, but I had adopted this kid who I had mentored as an undergraduate and subsequently, so it's a big brother, big sister program, and I became his legal guardian. And he was a young black kid. At the time he was 11, and I was a 26, 27-year-old white guy who was in the closet. And that was not an opportune time to come out when you adopt, when you basically become the sort of white adoptive father of a black child. Not exactly the time to sort of come screaming out of the closet and start, going to pride parades. And so I didn't. I kept myself in the closet for a bit while longer until he finally said to me one day, "Tim, are you gay?" Because he realized, because he knew me so well and he loved me, how miserable I was. Right, so here I was, being perceived as coming back and saving this young black kid, and he was the one who did the saving. And so for me, I didn't really come out in earnest until I was about 30, and so, the LGBT work that I've done is really only in the last decade.
Right, but it's been a kind of extraordinary decade in those in those terms. So,
yeah,
I mean, you talk about the nostalgia for things that you don't have a memory of, so I suppose Stonewall might be one of those moments for you. But I mean, it has been an extraordinary time in the last decade. Extraordinarily frustrating too. But can you talk about the kind of politics of sexuality in these last 10 years?
Well, I mean, one of the things is, I mean, I am working on this book now, which is called Stonewall's Children, which tries to map out the generations of LGBT folks in our modern history. And one of the things that I sort of argue in this piece, I kind of construct this taxonomy of generations. So I have the Stonewall generation, which was a generation around a kind of liberationist ethic, where people came out sort of around the time of Stonewall, although obviously Stonewall wasn't the first and only moment of coming out. People had been out beforehand, and they had been organized long before Stonewall ever happened. But there was a moment where a moment of liberation was catalyzed by that. And that created a certain kind of generational sensibility of people, coming out and moving to places like San Francisco and New York and so forth, and establishing institutions and pride parades and these kinds of cultural expressions of homosexuality that were real. And then as we move from the 70s to the 80s, you get a very different generational experience. The AIDS generation has a very different experience than the Stonewall generation. And all of a sudden, there was disease, there was death, there was despair, there was incredible discrimination and oppression in politics, where gay people were seen as unassimilable, right, contaminating, particularly gay men, and then as we move from the 80s into the 90s, you have another sort of great shift, moving out of the Reagan era into the Clinton era, when Bill Clinton was really the first president, certainly the first president ever elected, presidential candidate ever elected, who campaigned on a pro-LGBT platform, right? I mean, he was positioned himself as a friend of the gays, and still is seen as someone, inexplicably to me, given what happened during his presidency, but there are lots of people who are still immensely loyal. There's an enormous LGBT following for Hillary Clinton, and a lot of that had to do with the affection that had been forged for her husband, despite the fact, from my perspective, he threw us under the bus the first time he could. I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post early on in Obama's presidency where I said, Barack Obama, America's first gay president, playing on the riff that Toni Morrison called Bill Clinton the first black president. So I was calling the first black president the real first black president, the first gay president. And I remember in that piece I said something about that Bill Clinton loved us and left us, and Barack Obama wants to date us a little while longer before he makes a commitment. And I think that's an apt sort of description of the two of them. And so you get under Clinton right away, don't ask, don't tell. He signs the Defense of Marriage Act into law, and there are a lot of things during the Clinton administration, those two in particular, given the politics right now, very prescient, prophetic kinds of moments, right? Don't ask, don't tell, and the Defense of Marriage Act are the two things that preoccupy the LGBT movement right now, getting rid of them. We've just repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and now DOME is, I think, on its way out, but it's going to require a lot of work before that happens. So in many ways, these compromise measures that Clinton claims he was sort of coerced into signing into law as a compromise with Republican and conservative elements set up the sort of great dramas and the great sort of focus of the movement over the last 20 years. And so, and this generation, the kind of the marriage generation, I'm calling it, has another profoundly different kind of experiences than the Stonewall or the AIDS generation. So I'm sort of mapping out this history. And one of the things that I think is interesting, not only are there kind of moments of disruption with the emergence of AIDS and then the election of Bill Clinton, are moments of generational kind of disruption, I believe. And so these three generations, roughly defined, really have profoundly different experiences, which makes cross-generational empathy and understanding within the LGBT community very, very difficult. And one of the things that we know from outsider social movements that seek to sort of make a group of people who are seen as being foreign or outside acceptable to the sort of larger American society, is that we know that we need coalitional politics, but we also need intergenerational politics. I mean, the civil rights movement had that, or the women's movement has that. In large part, the labor movement has that. In large part because these stories of past struggles and of sort of historic battles and of triumphs and tragedies have been passed on in stories, literally through families. And the LGBT movement, until very recently, hasn't had that same kind of structure. And so the storytelling across generations, the passing on of these rituals, of these histories, of these experiences, of these political struggles, has been very disrupted. And so there's these real breaks between generations, and as a result, the old timer, the liberationists, are looking at this generation and saying, marriage, the military, are you fucking kidding me? Like, that's not why we rose up after Stonewall. The AIDS generation, many of the people who experienced that have died, right? I mean, I was born, too early or too late to have experienced the full-blown sort of tragedy of AIDS, so to speak. I have friends who are 4, 5, 6 years older than me who went to a funeral every weekend. I've never been to a funeral for someone who died of AIDS. I know no one who has died of AIDS. I know people who are HIV positive. I know people who are living with the cocktail. I know people who have been diagnosed, but I don't know anyone. I have never been to a funeral of someone who died of AIDS. And that is a profoundly different experience than people who are 10 years older than I am have had. And so, we may be able to talk about that, but we don't have the same context from which to understand a common sort of experience upon which we can construct a common history, upon which we can construct a common identity in politics.
Right. Not even a narrative.
Not even a narrative. It's a disruptive, it's a broken narrative. Mm-hmm. And so I think that and as a result, and that we as individual gay, lesbian, bi, trans people haven't yet figured out a way to tell our story that connects us, our individual lives and struggles, with this larger narrative of the nation. And social movements, successful social movements, always do that. Civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, were brilliant at sort of taking the African American struggle for freedom and mapping it onto this larger narrative of America's sort of ideals and its potential for progress, the more perfect union that Obama invokes all the time. But he's tapping into this deep strain of American optimism, but it's optimism based on the willingness to struggle to get that freedom, to get to the promised land, to reach those moments of the mountaintops. And we don't have that same kind of thing. And if you think about it, where are our sites of organizing? Where have they been historically? They've been in bars, mm-hmm. right? And bars are places where we go. We go to forge community, but often we go there to sort of lie about ourselves, right? And when we're forging these relationships, often we won't, especially in the early days, people wouldn't say their names or where they were from, right? They would engage in acts of deception in order to form some kind of connection. That's a very different kind of cultural and social process than going to church and organizing a march or the Birmingham or the Montgomery bus boycott in a church. That's a very different thing, right? Going to the Stonewall Inn and having a bunch of drinks and dancing together to Judy Garland and going home and having sex with one another is a very different kind of social experience than being in the basement of a church trying to organize a march. That's not to say those bars did not become politicized. They did, right? And they have been. And a lot of gay bars are these places where you have a mix of social, sexual, and political work being done. But when you think about the process of social interaction, particularly for people that have been able to hide themselves, mm-hmm. right? I mean, that's one of the most profound differences, is that gay people, for the most part, can go back in the closet, right? That all of us, that our story of liberation is the story of coming out of the closet, of making ourselves known, visible, expressed, articulated to a broader world, which then brings a whole set of other kinds of violences or discriminations or what have you. But that's a very different experience than being black, right? And obviously there are gay black people too who navigate those things differently. One of the reasons I think there's a sort of hesitancy among some folks in the black community to identify a kind of queer or gay identity. It's like, we already got enough going on with the fact that we're black. Like, why do we want to add that too? Mm-hmm. So I may go over here and have sex with some man. If I'm a man, I'm going to have sex with a man on the down low, but I'm not going to, go to a pride parade and say, hey, I had sex with that guy, he's my partner and we're queer, right? Because the last thing I need is another thing to struggle against, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very complicated, I think, and we have a different kind of history that doesn't map onto the sort of national narratives and even the kind of radical historical narratives that we have as templates for how to create social change. And so I think we need to figure out how to forge our own narrative, one that relates to these other narratives, but is its own thing. And if you think about the coming out story, the coming out story really is a story of alienation from where you come from. Or the coming out story is often one of, I left my family because my family hates me. I left my church because my church hates me. I left my home community because I didn't feel safe there, right? I went somewhere else. It's a narrative of alienation. It's a narrative of dislocation. It's a narrative of individual sort of agency to move away from a collective, right? And you think about so many of the coming out stories are that. Those are dimensions of storytelling that take us away from, that resist the formation of a collective, right? And that, so often we, sort of reinvent ourselves when we move away from all of those things into another place. Certainly, we've all done that. And part of my activism as an LGBT activist is in some ways a reinvention of myself, right? I mean, it's, I started out doing a lot of other work, and I mean, I consider myself a sort of ally, but an ally at a distance, right? I remember wearing a shirt in college that said straight but not narrow, right? And I mean, think of it. The profound irony is embedded in that I'm making myself visible as an ally to gay people, so that I wouldn't be seen as a gay person, which I was, right? And it's that's a different kind of dynamic that leads to a different kind of identity formation, and therefore requires, I think, a different sense of a different construction of history and of politics.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but
Sure.
Can you let's end just by having you reflect a little bit on this current moment that we're in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and you can define that in any way you want. There are a lot of different ways that people have. I mean, there's the Obama moment. It's the the post 9/11 moment. It's the Tea Party moment. It's lately it's the Wisconsin moment.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
which is really the Egyptian moment.
The
right?
Egyptian
It's
moment,
our
exactly.
Egyptian moment, right?
Exactly. So, one of the metaphors that I've used to describe this moment is there's that scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where a very important question is going to be decided, and they flip a coin, and it lands on its edge, and it stays on its edge. And I kind of feel, historically, like that's kind of where we've been for a couple of years.
Yeah.
But the optimist that you are, I'd love to hear you just talk about how you see this current moment in the U.S. and what your outlook is.
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, progress is not inevitable. And I do believe that to my core. And so I don't believe, as important as I think the election of Barack Obama was for the country, not just because he was the first African-American president, he is the first African-American president. That's hugely significant, profoundly significant, in a way that, can't be diminished or discounted. I think it's easy now to be like, oh, okay, that happened. No, that was profound. And it always will be. And I think that, it still chokes me up to talk about that night. But that doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden in some kind of post-racial, you've talked about this, this as well as anybody, we're in some post-racial kumbaya moment where everything's going to be fine once the economy recovers, right? And I think that one of the things that we need to be very careful of as citizens, and I mean citizens in the broadest sense of being citizens, co-workers in the kingdom of culture, as Du Bois brilliantly put it, in Souls of Black Folk at the beginning of the last century, which proved to be a century with a color line problem, just as this one is proving to shape up in the same way in some ways. I think it's really important for us to understand that we can't see these kind of moments as triumphs, as movements for transformation. I think one of the things that was so dangerous about the moment of Barack Obama's election is that those of us who were involved in the campaign, and many of us were involved in the campaign, thought of it as a social movement, right? Thought of it as a kind of reincarnation of the civil rights movement, and it wasn't that. At the end of the day, the Obama campaign, the goal of the Obama campaign was finite and conservative. It was to get this guy elected president of the United States so that there could be a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another in the presidency, which is the highest office of the land. That is an inherently preserves the status quo of our political institutions, right, which are inherently conservative because they're self-interested in preserving themselves. And so the goal of that was finite and conservative, when the goal of progressive social movements is ongoing and transformative. And so for us to think about the Obama campaign as a social movement was a great act of delusion on our part, and I am as guilty as anyone was of that. So I think that one of the things that we need to do is shake ourselves out of that, realize that what that was important, what that was significant in all sorts of ways, meaningful, deeply meaningful. There's a reason why everyone cried, right? It's the reason why I still get choked up when I talk about those days, right? That was a profoundly emotional, cathartic moment for the country for a whole host of reasons that we all know from our history. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, right? And so we have to take this historic moment and make history again. Right, and that's going to require all of us, right? And it also, I think, the election of Barack Obama is yet another reminder of what I've been talking about: the inevitability, the lack of inevitability of progress, right? That if we fool ourselves into thinking that the election of one black man to an office that no black person has ever held before is going to usher in a new kind of era of racial sensitivity and sensibility and equality and so forth, then we've learned nothing from our history, right? It's another reminder of precisely what I'm talking about, that progress is not inevitable, that we make our present and our future, right? And that's what history is it's an ongoing series of battles over big issues to remake society or to preserve society so that it won't be remade. I mean, that's what history is, right? It's the great conflict between those kinds of forces. And, so this is a moment in that history that I think we kind of fell back into to watch as spectators, right? We became kind of, oh, Barack Obama elected, this is awesome, we'll cry, we'll celebrate, and then we'll sit back and he'll fix everything, right? When in fact, actually, this is a moment where we should have, we had an opportunity for that campaign to actually become a social movement for transformation in the country. And now what it is it's a really, really big email list. And so I think if we have any optimism at this moment, it's that we have, I think, moved from, there has been a shift of power from a very conservative, reactionary, warmongering, fear-mongering kind of regime that was interested in exporting democracy in an imperialist model and in making sure that we structure the political and economic system of this country so that it preserves and widens the gap between rich and poor, to a different kind of model of power, which is attempting to figure out how to move back from that imperial project and to move back from this preservation of a capitalist system that creates vast inequalities of riches, to figure out what we do next. And I think that at the end of the day, the two big questions are what we do, how do we transform war into peace, and how do we transform poverty into equality or opportunity, right? And I think that Barack Obama, because of his upbringing and because of his kind of temperament, but this is not a warmonger, even though he inherited 2 wars and he seems to be, ramping up Afghanistan. I don't think that at his core he's a warmonger. I think that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were. I do not think that Joe Biden and Barack Obama are. But whether or not they have the capacity to turn war into peace depends on whether or not we have the capacity to demand that that take place.
Right.
And similarly with capitalism and with our economy, we have to demand these things. That's why the Wisconsin
so that's
piece
I guess
is
where
so
I kind of
important.
wanted to end is your historian's sense of, so here we are, it's early March 2011. The State House in Madison has been occupied by for about 2 weeks.
Right, and then these Democratic legislatures have refused to come back.
The Tea Party governor has not been able to ram through his program. What's your historian's sense of how important the Tea Party is in the long run and how important this moment in Wisconsin is in the long run?
Well, it's interesting because I've been asked about the Tea Party almost every day since they started going to the town hall meetings that summer before the election. And one of the things that, or 2 summers ago, I guess, one of the things that I'm buoyed by, I love the Wisconsin protests. I think it's so energizing, it's so wonderful, and it's so wonderfully important that they take place at the same time that all of these democratic uprisings are happening in the Middle East, these peaceful democratic uprisings, some of which in Libya are being resisted by great violence and reaction by state dictators, some of which are not, right? And so we have very different models of how these, I think with respect to how those uprisings, how that kind of democratic proliferation is going, I think there is a model of peaceful demands to overthrow ancient regimes and replace them with something that is more modern, that is more equitable, that is, more youthful and forward-looking. There are different responses to that in different places depending on the kind of dictator that exists. But I think it's really wonderful for us to think about Wisconsin in a global democratic context, right? That this is not just a U.S. thing, because I think one of the things that must happen for us to to really be in the 21st century is for us to realize that our national borders should be and must be more porous, if not dismantled altogether, right? That these sort of rigid nationalisms was part of the problem of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Some of the great violence of the bloodiest century was because of these kind of rigid national boundaries, and we participated fully in that, the policing of those boundaries, even when we were disrupting them by going to war for unjust reasons in other nation states. And so I think I want to see Wisconsin and Madison as the protest there as part of a global democratic possibility at this moment in our world history. Because I think it's important to place that in context. And I think it's important because I think the folks in Madison are talking about Egypt and the folks in Egypt are talking about Madison. And we need to get on board with that. I think that's important. You know, specifically with regard to what's happening in Madison and this sort of the Tea Party element within this country, I think that, you know, what the protests have done, you know, is to make visible this kind of protest tradition that I've written about and talk about, this kind of radical tradition of protesting these kinds of, you know, power plays in the public arena. I think that this is the most recent and most dramatic expression of that kind of democratic tradition in this country that has so enriched it. And I think part of it is that this is in some ways a reaction to a power grab to take away so many of the things that we have now for many years taken for granted. The right of people to collectively bargain, right? The idea that we pay taxes for a common good that supports public institutions, where public servants who are good folks can do the work that so many people in the private sector refuse to do. And so for many, in some ways, this is to protect all of the gains that have been made by all these past protest movements. So it's really in that tradition as a way to guard against a power grab to take that away. But it also, I think, reflects a kind of insurgent sensibility that the public is good. Mm-hmm. And that the public has been under assault, under siege for 35 years in this country. And that for, you know, literally, you know, what amounts for 2 generations, you know, we've been, you know, waging an all-out war in the public sphere. And I think what this is, the kind of, you know, literally the taking over of the State House, of this sort of outpouring of public will and public support, these public officials engaged in acts of civil disobedience so that they won't actually be forced and coerced into voting for this horrible, hideous assault on all these you know, public workers and state workers. And the right to collectively bargain, I think, is really remarkable. But I also think, so I think that gives me enormous possibility and hope. The flip side of that is that actually something that actually deepens that sense of possibility and hope for me is the fact that the Tea Party may be an unprecedented thing in American history, where this mobilization, which was ostensibly an outsider mobilization, has been so quickly integrated into one of our 2 major political parties. And I remember a year ago, people asked me, these documentary filmmakers are doing a documentary on the Tea Party Rising, and they went all over the country and followed these folks. They asked me, you know, what historical precedent was there for them? So I talked about, you know, the you know, Birch Society. I talked about the Know Nothings. I talked about all these folks, and I talked about the lynch mobs. You know, the gentlemen of property and standing who lynched black folks. But I think one of the things that's interesting to me is I'm not sure there is a historical precedent for that, right? But there have been outsider groups, the abolitionists, the populists, and various folks who have, over time, integrated into the political system and had some kind of power or force in the political system. But it seems to me that the Tea Party, never before has it happened this fast. I mean, it literally emerged after Barack Obama was elected, partly out of economic anxiety, partly out of racism, partly out of a kind of libertarian sense that all government is bad. So it was a mix of complicated...
Which they never seemed to worry so much about during the Bush years.
Right, they never worried about this during the Bush years, and they don't seem to be worrying about it too much now in the Republican Party. And so it's interesting to me that I always was suspicious of the populist energy of the Tea Party. Partly because I knew that there were all these funding structures and Dick Armey's Freedom Works and these kinds of, top-down, the Koch brothers and these kinds of top-down sources of funding and control and so forth, that they were always there. But it seems to me, no outsider movement has ever had that much of a say in a party's political party's internal dynamics during an election year that quickly in the history of the United States. And that, to me, is cause for optimism, because when social movements get co-opted by political parties, they die. They die. Whatever insurgent spirit that seeks to transform society in whatever way, whether it's in a conservative way or in a progressive way.
Right. It's like a sausage grinder.
It's a sausage grinder.
What
Once
comes out the
the
other
social
end
movement
is like a New Deal style.
Exactly. It's one of the reasons I love the abolitionists, right? There were some abolitionists who were willing to go with the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party and the Republican Party. They did that. There were some of them that did it. There were a lot of them that said, no, we're not going in there. Or they'd use the parties to their advantage when they thought that they could have an advantage, and then they'd move right back outside into the public sphere, and they'd go edit a newspaper, or they'd go give a speech, or they'd go organize people at anti-slavery fairs, right? And so they went back and forth, right? The Tea Party, it seems to me at least, right now, to be moving to being, casting its lot, hitching its wagon to the star of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is not a dazzling star right now. That is not the North Star. Right? That is not the North Star. They are in big trouble. And so to have this quote unquote insurgency, which was represented initially as this great populist uprising of people who wanted the government off their backs, at this time when this black menace was coming in, who was probably Muslim and foreign born, who's going to, control all of our lives and take away all of our guns, right? To have that insurgency, and I don't believe that it was a fully grassroots insurgency, now so fully integrated into the Republican Party, let it cause trouble there.
Right.
Because it will die there ultimately. And so, I'm optimistic about the fact that the Tea Party has been mainstreamed quicker than any outsider social movement in the history of the United States. And when that happens, folks who aren't involved in that process of mainstreaming will benefit, because the best of their insurgent energy will be co-opted.
So there it is. What's the name of that pool?
McElligot's Pool.
McElligot's Pool.
McElligot's
Pool.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your generosity and your time, and thank you so much.
I appreciate this project. It's terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
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 Thank you so much.
Thanks.